webinar we've done in conjunction with the Ambassador Partnership, and it's great to be able to bring former ambassadorial insight and expertise to the discussion. So very much looking forward to that today. So we all know that the impact on this sector has been absolutely enormous. During the course of the pandemic, we've seen airlines making mass redundancies. We've seen many public transport operators seeking public subsidies, travel operators questioning, in some cases, their very future. The implications will go beyond the private sector, though, of course, to public policy, to government investment. Travel is so important in our daily lives. Beyond breaks, vacations, holidays, we obviously rely on travel for getting to and from work, and our economies rely to varying degrees, of course, on tourism. So this is a very broad and deep discussion potentially. The virus has thrown the future of our need to travel for work and for leisure into some question, and there's no doubt that we will see some shifts and some changes in behaviour as a result of it. Undoubtedly, it will have a longer-term impact on the sector and cause some changes to its very economics. The impact of that upheaval runs deeper than just the businesses that provide travel operations, though. Of course, it is something that will impact public policy, government investment, and have profound implications over the long term. So we have a very high-level panel today to discuss all of that with us. We thank them all for taking part in this session. Garvin Nicholas, first of all, I'll introduce Garvin. He's the former Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago. He's one of a former High Commissioner to the UK for Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly that's one of the most beautiful destinations for tourists in the Caribbean. So we're looking forward to Garvin's Caribbean perspective on all of this. We will have Rosella Carrara joining us, and Rosella is Vice President for External Relations and Sustainability for the cruise company Costa Group. And Costa Group has, of course, faced many sensitive issues throughout the crisis. It's never been too far from the headlines, so we're very much looking forward to her sector perspectives. James Watt is former British ambassador to Egypt, Jordan, and the Lebanon, all three of which have strong tourism sectors. They've, of course, had to navigate many issues and crises over the years in those countries, but now face a very different one with COVID-19. So welcome to James. And then Ido Aharoni is a former member of Israel's Foreign Service. He served 25 years there and was also founder of the Brand Israel program. So he's a senior advisor to APCO Worldwide, and we are looking forward to hearing Ido's insights from a national brand perspective, and I'm sure we'll hear other perspectives from him as well. So what's the format? We're going to hear each panelist give their views on the pressures, priorities, and political ramifications for the travel and tourism sector. That should take us about 25 minutes, and then we're going to move on to a Q&A session. All of our guests today are automatically muted, so if you want to raise a question during that Q&A, you either raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screens, or drop a question into the chat box, and we'll endeavour to pick that up and field it to one of our panelists. So without further ado, Garvin, if you'd like to kick us off and give us your perspectives on how this crisis is going to impact tourism in the Caribbean and the priorities in the response to it.
Yes, well, of course, the first two considerations that I think are the most important considerations are safety and the economy. As you may or may not be aware, the quick action or the timely action by most Caribbean governments closing borders allowed for the containment of the virus. So that, for example, if you look at Antigua, Barbuda, Anguilla, Barbados, Belize, Cayman Islands, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Bahamas, they all have between 0 and 10 deaths over the period. So that just shows the level of containment that has actually taken place. For most of those countries, you're not really seeing any new cases. For us in Trinidad, we recently had an additional, I think it was 4 or 5 cases, but that was because we allowed crew members who are citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to return from cruise ships that have been sort of docked outside. And by them returning, they were, of course, immediately quarantined and tested. And that is where we got the new infections. So that they're really imported cases, which, of course, makes it even more of a difficulty when you look at reopening the borders. Of course, again, it must be stated that unlike Trinidad and Tobago, where we have a tourist contribution to our GDP hovering between sort of 7 and 8%, the other islands, their contribution to GDP sort of hovers around 40 to, in some cases, as high as 70%. So that moving on to the second issue, which is that of the economy, we have seen where a lot of the Caribbean economies have been devastated. There's a lot of unemployment as a result of it. We're seeing where hotels have closed, and there is simply no economic activity on some of the islands to talk about. This makes it, of course, extremely urgent for the borders to reopen to tourists. So now you're seeing where there has to be an extremely delicate balancing act taking place. Countries like Grenada, Jamaica reopen their borders in stages starting the 15th of June. Grenada and a couple of the other countries, I think Bahamas, etc., they're looking at the 1st of July to start reopening their borders. But of course, there are going to be very strict protocols in place. There is still the issue of curfews from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. in some of the countries. And they don't really have any idea how they're going to treat with cruise ship arrivals and major tourist arrivals. A lot of the countries have started retraining their staff in the hospitality industry. There's been a call by some quarters to get the private sector involved in subsidizing some of these jobs because, of course, in some of the smaller islands, they don't have a strong safety net, social safety net. So therefore, people are being really left destitute. Again, we are fortunate in Trinidad and Tobago because we have an oil and gas driven economy traditionally and a strong manufacturing sector. But even so, our largest tourism product is our carnival. And that, of course, is very crowd-centric because it revolves around large fetes and street festivals. So that the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Tourism, and of course all the other significant ministries in Trinidad and Tobago have been reviewing policies for Carnival next year, and whether in fact the Carnival can go on has been a topic of conversation. Of course, this year, when COVID sort of became known to the world, it was just at the beginning of the middle of our Carnival season, and a decision had to be made whether to continue with the Carnival or not. Again, I think extremely fortunate for us. We did not see the levels of COVID tourism that has taken place in many of the other countries. Of course, again, reopening our borders to tourists, we have to be cognizant in the Caribbean that the main originators of tourism would be Florida, New York, London, and parts of Europe that have had major problems with COVID. So that has to be considered greatly. In moving forward, there's also been the conversation where talk is about reshaping the conversation with cruise ship companies, renegotiating better deals, forming greater partnerships with airlines, so that they'll be a lot more cognizant of the need to sanitize and ensure that people entering traveling from their destinations to the Caribbean are indeed COVID-free. So those are the sort of considerations for the time being, and of course that can be expanded upon later.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Garvin. So I believe Rosella has some problems joining us, so hopefully she will be able to join us later. But in the meantime, James, could I ask you just to pick up the reins and give a perspective from your part of the world in terms of where you used to be, but also any sort of general, more international viewpoints on how you think the world is adjusting from a travel perspective and what the priorities are.
Thank you very much, Steve. I used to look at the whole world from my perspective as the head of the whole consular operation in London. And so, as well as my direct experience of Egypt and other places like that, I've always got the whole picture, I think, more or less in mind. I know I'm speaking to an audience of professionals, so I mustn't say anything too obvious. But perhaps I could just drill down to what I think the key factor is, which is trust. Trust at a personal level. This is a personal reaction and decision that people take, and they can be influenced by groups. Groups can reinforce trust, but ultimately it's individuals who decide whether they're going to take a certain degree of risk or not. And as you know, there's a whole spectrum of people from risk takers to the extremely risk averse. And I hardly need to tell this audience as well, we're not only talking about tourism, we're talking about travelers in general, many of whom are leisure travelers, or at least a large element of what their motive is leisure, rather than thinking of themselves as tourists. And I think talking about, first of all, tourism to the United Kingdom, and that is principally London. I'm sorry to say, I know the rest of the country deserves better, but in fact, London gets by far the biggest share of all these tourists. As we all know, there's a very diverse mix of people coming. There's people coming sometimes for family reasons, to visit a relative or friends, or to pursue study, or to go to a certain event or whatever, right through to the other end of the spectrum, which is the group of first-time travelers who possibly haven't traveled very much before, who are very dependent on their group and very dependent on being guided. And I think in classic terms in the last few years, that's been true of a lot of Chinese groups, which we see in central London. But it is a very diverse field. And I feel that leisure travel, as opposed to just tourism, will pick up quite quickly as a result, being led, I should say, by people who already know the score here, who know London, or who know where they're going to be, what it's going to be like, and who are confident enough to know they're going to enjoy it. Complete escapism and sort of discovery travel. I've never been here before, and I've always wanted to go to London. I think that'll be a bit slower to come. And I think we need to think how the risk is perceived. It's perceived, first of all, by reporting. Could be on the mainline media, it could be on social media, it could be by word of mouth. It could be the subject of some distorted information, deliberately or otherwise, with risks exaggerated or underplayed. And there's a limited scope for advertising, for government-led advertising or industry advertising, to try and correct the perspective. I think there is a role for that. It has to be done. But any event can set it back. I don't think New Zealand, for example, would have been set back significantly by the latest. You've all seen the little case of a couple of New Zealand women who had suddenly found they brought COVID into the country and thought they had got rid of it. I don't think New Zealand will be damaged for long, and in fact, I think their credibility will be enhanced by the measures they're taking. But in general, I think any kind of second wave or outbreak or whatever will cause another wobble of confidence. And I mustn't go on for more than my 6 minutes, but looking at the other angle, which is outward tourism from the UK, it's exactly the same. It's a question of how much do people trust to their own safety in the destination they're going to. And again, familiarity is a reassuring factor. An advanced economy with an advanced medical sector, like Spain, for example, would be very reassuring, I think. Slightly less so Turkey, for reasons I don't know whether that's justified or not, but I think in people's perceptions, Egypt probably even less so. And people will be perceiving the risk of catching the virus, and then of being treated correctly or not medically, but also then of being quarantined. What are the rules? Would you be slammed into quarantine? Under what conditions and for how long? These are risks that people have to assess at the moment. And I just want to finish by the other major factor in my experience is the insurers. Foreign Office travel advice is usually taken as the gold standard by insurers who want to, who will always cancel or go ahead with their package or their tour or their cover or whatever on the basis of whether the Foreign Office is signaling it's all right. The Foreign Office is very cautious. I know that because I used to be in charge of it. It used to frustrate me. And we're too cautious, and I think insurers and the commercial sector generally are sometimes missing quite a few tricks by just following that standard. I'm not saying take risks, but I do think that it's the moment has come to review whether the insurance industry in particular should be paying such strict attention to Foreign Office travel advice. And of course, the other aspect of insurance is the individual insurance. You've got people who will have medical insurance, they'll have risk, they'll have trip cancellation insurance and so on. But is it available? At what cost? What are the terms? Will that change? I haven't got the answers to that yet because I think it's all still quite new. But I'd be very interested to hear from the discussion about anybody who has views on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Right. Some very interesting points there around communication, trust, and yes, indeed, risk and attitude to risk. So thank you for that. Ido, could I go to you? I guess trust is a very good segue into country branding and what countries do to persuade people that that the risks have been managed and that they are open for visitors again. So over to you.
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much. I will share a few slides with you, and then I'd like to, since I am in Jerusalem and Israel, I would say is about 90% back into normal. Then I would like to draw some conclusions from what we've learned, mostly about domestic tourism. But we're already seeing, if those of you who attended the first conference call that we held on this very issue, I spoke about the inevitable clash. The clash is already happening, and it's happening between two forces, very powerful forces. One force that says there has to be a new order. We have to rethink our ways. We have to consume responsibly. We have to be more considerate about the environment. One of the questions that we have here on the table today is whether the airline industry should go greener than it had done before and so on. We should see a more collaborative form of international relations, very similar to what happened in the world post-World War II, when the world recreated the League of Nations with a very optimistic and progressive United Nations Charter in 1945 in San Francisco. And so that's very powerful conversation. And what we're seeing in the streets of the United States is an expression of that desire to instill new ideas and install new order. And then the other force, represented by people like Donald Trump, is basically saying, wait, hold your horses. Pre-COVID-19, we experienced an unprecedented level of prosperity. Let's resume the old order as quickly as we can. And it's confusing because the stock market is doing very well. The recovery, at least in the United States, when it comes to the public investment sector, has been remarkably swift. And so, and the implications of this clash are beginning to unfold in front of our eyes. The possible scenarios are going to impact definitely the tourism industry, but way beyond that. Whether it's the United States or Europe or other nations that were hit hard by COVID-19, will the government, the national government, have the power, the vision, the stamina to introduce a new deal with all of its implications? The shift to flexible economy, we'll talk about that in the context of tourism, extremely important. And again, the importance of collaboration and the resumption of responsible, purposeful competition. And I can say that the upcoming November elections are going to be critical, way beyond the boundaries of the United States. I think it's going to be critical for the whole world as to the outcome of that clash between the new order people versus the old order people. Talking about brands, how do we measure the well-being of a nation brand? We all know that the nations are recognized and are unique because of their national narratives, right? So for example, in the United States, the national ethos is called the American dream. It's all about the land of opportunity. If you're willing to work hard, be decent, law-abiding citizen, a productive citizen, then the sky is the limit. It's a very powerful narrative. In Israel, for obvious reasons, the narrative is never again. To prevent a second Holocaust is an entirely different mindset. It explains a lot about the differences in the culture. But reputational security, meaning the actions that a nation is able to do in order to protect its own reputation, are being tested by the COVID-19 crisis. For example, if you look at the United States as a brand, I can say that the presidency of Donald Trump did not really diminish the value of the United States as a brand until COVID-19, because COVID-19 exposed the issue of profound, deep-seated, well-rooted inequality in the United States, and that is affecting the reputational security of the United States as a brand. So the COVID-19 crisis is impacting the national ethos. The way the UK is dealing with COVID-19, the way Sweden has dealt with COVID-19 and so on, is going to have an impact on our national ethos, which is, in the language of psychologists, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. I think the ambassador already mentioned the importance of the trust factor, and I could not agree more. And lastly, the status of your nation's promise is also tested by COVID-19 with your ability to be flexible and move quickly. When we talk about the tourism industry, there are three elements that were profoundly impacted by the crisis. The first is mass travel, whether air travel or cruise ships. What are going to be the solutions? Are they going to be the installation of physical dividers like they're doing in restaurants all over the place here in Israel? Is mass travel with distancing, physical distancing, is going to be sufficient? Is there a business model that could accommodate that? Will we be able to see efficient testing at the airport? We have to understand that COVID-19 is redefining the very meaning of the word safety, just as 9/11 redefined the concept of safety in air travel, and HIV redefined the concept of safety in sexual relations. COVID-19 is redefining the concept of safety in interpersonal interactions. And will we be able to come up with a process that will allow us to determine whether a person is infected within minutes at the airport? This will change a lot. This will change the entire industry. The other aspect is a lot of people travel to attend events, whether large conferences, conventions, sporting events. So mass gatherings, the future of mass gatherings, are we going to see a hybrid of a virtual platform for mass gatherings to support and supplement the physical event, which is, I think, the next big thing in remote learning, distant learning. And then lastly, informational distancing, which is a term coined by University of Southern California professor that describes the hazards of information overload. Again, it's something that could impact the tourism industry. I'll be more than happy to answer questions about that during the Q&A session. And last slide, the factors that matter, as I said before, COVID-19 is redefining what it means to be safe, and what are the factors that could predict successful recovery. We see it already in Greece, we see it already in Cyprus. It's a very strict adherence to hygiene, and everything has to be sterilized, everything has to be visible, everything has to make the customer feel very, very comfortable. Very tight security. Going below the line, meaning there's no point at this stage to waste money above the line on big advertising campaigns or billboards. What we need to do is work with those devices and micro-target our audience, our potential clients. Government subsidies are a must. Economies that will recover will do that with the help of their own governments, and I mentioned already flexibility. A couple of words to conclude about Israel. What we're seeing in Israel as a case study is very, very interesting. For the months, so Israel, as I said before, is 90% back to normal. There is no foreign travel to Israel. In early August, Israel will open the lines to Greece and Cyprus, but this is going to be only in August, so we are a month and a half away from the first approval to travel outside of Israel for Israelis. However, several very, very interesting already happened with 90% of the market back into normal. For the months of July and August, we already have reports from Israel's hotel industry of 250% occupancy rate, which means that the hotels are hysterically overbooked, but it means that the Israelis are desperate to travel. They want to go out and they want to spend time with their families in resorts all over the country. 250% occupancy. We've never had that. 90% of the credit card activity was resumed. So we're only 10% below when we look at the number of credit transactions. The stock market in Israel bounced back just like the American stock market. And so the lessons that the Israeli travel industry is right now experiencing and trying to implement, in the first place, is to solve the problem of insurance. Again, the ambassador spoke about it. Very, very important point. The insurance industry doesn't have the tools to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. And believe it or not, if you're an Israeli now who has a permission to travel abroad, no one is allowed to provide you with insurance. The ability to quickly train human resources from one sector to another, for example, from hotels to hospitals, becomes very, very critical, because the tourism industry is one of the backbones of Israel's economy, just as it is the backbone of Spain's economy and France's economy and the UK and Greece and so on and so forth. And governments simply do not and will not have the luxury of just letting that sector sink. That's what I have to say as a starter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. Fascinating perspectives and encouraging updates in all of that. So, unfortunately, Rosella Carrara has not been able to join us yet, but if we could just finish with my colleague Zoe Thorogood. Zoe is our crisis lead at APCO in the UK, but also previously worked in the communications team for the UK government. So, always interesting to hear her perspectives. Zoe, just anything you want to share on communications specifically? Obviously, UK government communications has been much under the microscope over the past few months, but just looking at that specifically from a tourism perspective, what are your observations?
Yeah, it's been an interesting time, certainly, and I'm really glad I'm not in the number 10 press office anymore, because I imagine that they're all under quite a lot of strain. I think from a comms point of view, as James was saying, the sort of the advice and guidance issued by the FCO, I think, has been very well handled and been actually very clear. I think where communications may have slightly fallen down, not to be too critical, but is that, you know, we've seen a bit of confusion over some of the messages and how they've been communicated out to people and in what order and at what time. And when it's sort of in relation to the travel and tourism industry, ministers going sort of onto broadcast or talking in the media about things like air bridges, which obviously, if they get the green light, which they haven't yet, would be hugely helpful and beneficial to the sector. I think, you know, from a communications point of view, it's been quite disappointing that some of that chat, for example, has not been either shut down or they've not, you know, made a clear decision. I also think it's quite a tough time for government, because they're trying to sort of do their best, as everybody is in this unprecedented situation, but they're also facing, you know, public calls from from the airlines. There's the potential legal challenge that's going ahead. And so I think that they're sort of trying to juggle multiple balls. And this sector and this industry has rather sort of fallen in and amongst all the others. And I don't think necessarily been sort of treated as well as it should have been. I think looking forward though, I would expect that when we have the next announcement at the end of June, early July, about changes to the rules, I think that by then, because people are starting to think about opening up, and because we're starting to think about traveling again, and perhaps whether people will be able to sort of either book business or leisure travel, either domestically or internationally, I think you will probably see quite a lot of guidance being given then. And I think by that time, hopefully, that Priti Patel will have made a decision on things like the air bridges, so that at least the industry and the sector can move forward. But yeah, so that's my perspective from a government point of view.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Thank you. So, across all of that, then, a real need for a very focused effort around safety, for clarity of communication, for an understanding of what's going to motivate people personally, to nurture trust, to make sure that risk is clearly understood, and potentially take a little more risk in all of that. So, lots to talk about. So if we could move now to the Q&A. Part of this session. So first question is from Bryce Whittaker. If COVID screening happens at airports, what would be the responsibility of airports to provide healthcare services to those deemed infected, especially to those who are traveling internationally? So Garvin, that may be an interesting question for you to answer. Particularly complex in the Caribbean, I'm sure, with, for example, people flying in to Barbados, one of the larger islands, transiting on to somewhere to a smaller destination. Obviously some complexity there in terms of who's responsible from a healthcare perspective. So have you been looking at that at all, and is there a joined up approach to planning?
The thing is, if it is that
so we're losing you slightly, Garvin.
Gatwick,
you're back.
Yeah, if you're leaving Gatwick, for example, and you
are... we seem to have lost audio.
Tested there, and you're found to be positive. Of course, yeah.
I'm sorry, Garvin. We're missing
let
your
me
answer a little.
Try to reconnect somewhere else.
Yeah, or take your camera off. If you turn the camera off, that's probably going to help. So that's mute. Okay, if you just take yourself off mute, Garvin, and we'll see if we can hear you.
Are you able to hear me now?
That seems better. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So what I'm saying is, if you are leaving, for example, Gatwick, and you're heading to Barbados, and you are tested positive at Gatwick, I suppose that the normal thing would be for the airport to send you back home, or to send you to seek medical attention. If, however, you arrive, and I can speak to Trinidad, if you arrive in Trinidad, whenever that happens, then we will obviously want to quarantine you. And because we've put in place a number of quarantine centers for returning residents. Mm-hmm. The minute a returning resident is allowed to return, shuttle directly to a government quarantine site where you are tested and you're quarantined for at least a week or two. And then you are let back into the public. And I suspect that would be the position you would have to take in all the other islands. The problem, however, would arise when too many tourists are arriving in some of the smaller islands with less developed health sectors. Because, of course, if your population is 100,000 or 60,000, you would have health systems designed for that population. If, however, you are getting plane loads of ill people, then that would, of course, create a burden on your health sector. And that idea issue of risk is what will determine when borders reopen, how they reopen, and to whom, I expect.
Okay, thank you. And actually, a follow-on question from Christopher Goodwin for you, Garvin. I think that's what is the position for travel from the USA to and from the Caribbean? You mentioned Florida, New York as sort of major risk centers. So, what's the position there as far as you're aware? What's your approach to it?
At the moment, in Trinidad, our borders are closed. The only people being allowed in are returning residents, and that is being done on a phased basis. So anybody else has to apply for special arrangements to be made on their behalf for them to come in. And we have not actually identified a time for the reopening of borders to non-citizens or residents. The country itself is about 80% open, but we don't have open cinemas and dine-in restaurants. We have takeaway restaurants.
Okay. We've just lost your voice again, Garvin. But
are open.
Right.
We also have Trinidad and Tobago, which allows for Tobago tourism.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Yes, no, great. Thank you very much. We're losing the audio a little, but thank you for that. So next question, I think this is one for you, Ida, also from Christopher Goodwin. What is the situation in all the countries bordering Israel? And how does that impact your approach?
So our part of the Mediterranean basin was not hit hard by COVID-19. We don't know exactly why. Maybe it has something to do with the climate. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that the population in this area tends to be younger. United States, for example, and Italy are relatively older population on average. United States, actually, the median age went up from 29 to 38 since the mid-1960s until today. So we don't know, but the situation in the area, especially in Egypt, surprisingly, in the refugee camps, we didn't see a major outbreak. Is pretty much under control. And here too, we see a spike in the number of people that are reported as infected, but we don't see a spike in the number of hospitalization, and thankfully also we don't see a spike in the number of fatalities, meaning that when you do more tests, when more testing is conducted, then you simply find more people that were infected but have no symptoms. So this is what we're seeing now in Israel. We went from 0 testing a day to nearly 15,000 tests per day. Just wanted to say something about the previous question about who's going to take care of the people that will be detected at the airports. I think that the solution will have to be a combination of some sort of an agreement between the governments and the local health providers.
Garvin, I think as you've dialed in twice, I think if you could just put yourself on mute, that'll prevent the distortion on the line.
So I said
thank you.
That I think the solution will be some sort of an agreement between the government and local healthcare providers. And I think that it could, I know it sounds crazy, but it could actually be a good business for the insurance industry as well as the HMOs.
Thank you. Okay, James, I think a question for you, if I may. This is from Ivor Hopkins. I guess we could interpret this different ways. Travel as a human right is the way that we do it right. So I'm thinking about your comment earlier about risk, and perhaps we need to be a little less tied to the Foreign Office stipulations and add an element of personal risk. So travel, a human right. People are itching to get away, itching to get away from the 4 walls they've been staring up for some time. Should people have a more personal choice over that?
I agree very much that travel has become such a strong expectation. It's assumed to be a right. And certainly millions and millions of Brits who every summer have been used for the last several decades for going off for a fortnight in the sun somewhere, they would consider it an essential part of their daily life, of their annual life anyway. And so it may not be legally a human right, but it certainly is a very, very strong expectation. I think people are more aware of the environmental impact of mass tourism and so on. I think people will always make excuses themselves personally, saying, well, this is my one holiday, or I really need it badly, and why should I deprive myself if everybody else is still going? So I think that we're a long, long way from there being any kind of mass movement to curtail that dash for the sun. It may have happened already a bit at the margins, but I think when British people experience the summer of trying to go on holiday in Britain, where everything is booked out, everything's expensive, there's certainly no room for tens of millions of people who would like a nice holiday in Britain, from Britain. They will say, no, I really do need to go back to whatever, Greece, Turkey, Spain. And I think that'll continue. And somehow we've got to reduce the climate impact of that in order to lessen the damage done. But for now, it is very, very difficult to change public opinion on that, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? On risk and personal risk?
I mean, to pick up your point about risk, I think there are risk takers. There are people who will, when they hear that a war has closed down some countries' tourism, they'll make a quick judgment saying, well, actually, that's an overreaction, and there'll be absolutely nobody visiting the pyramids or visiting wherever. And they race off and have a really good time. I think there's a certain counter-cyclical thing there, people saying, well, we're not going to follow the herd on this. And the way that travel has become more personalized, Airbnb, for example, you don't go and stay in a hotel. You feel safer if you're perhaps in your own space, it's been sanitized or whatever, you go and stay in the flat in Barcelona or whatever. So that's, I think there are lots of flexible ways in which people can make choices and take risks, yes, but also take calculated risks in the sense that they know they're reducing their exposure. I think people are very sensitive about enclosed spaces, and people are very sensitive about food, although I don't think, the cleanliness of food hygiene, but I don't think necessarily the COVID virus is transmitted greatly by food. But, these are all instincts people have, and they will be looking for the kind of formula which just meets their personal criteria for safety. And that'll ease up as more people do it, and you see, well, actually, lots of people have been to Spain this year, I might as well go as well. I think there will be a sort of a growing sort of sense of herd confidence, if you like, rather than herd immunity.
Herd confidence, great, thank you. So next question is from Andrew Evans. What are countries' tourism authorities and other relevant bodies doing to revive the sector through tourism promotional videos? I mean, I'm casting my mind back, if possible, it seems like a lifetime ago, to the sort of commercials we used to watch on television with shimmering seas and sandy beaches and mountains and ancient sites, etc. And you look at the way that other brands are changing their advertising today. It's much more practical, empathetic, action-oriented. So, do countries need to rethink on the way they promote themselves through advertising, etc.? Maybe Ido, you're nodding. That's one for you.
Yeah. There's a wonderful question. Yes, I believe that COVID-19 will give the final push to the transition from traditional blanket advertising to what we call segmentation, deep segmentation, and micro-marketing. Let me give you an example. So we have today the ability to know how many people are interested in, let's say, running a marathon. We know how many people are engaged in long distance running. We can actually communicate with them. We know where they are. We know where they congregate digitally, which hubs they go through. And we also know how to influence the conversation with them. So countries and places that would like to promote tourism in the future will have to come up with a list of hundreds of niche markets like long distance running, like extreme sports, like opera lovers, like classical music lovers, like foodies, and so on and so forth, and even a subdivision of foodies, people that like a certain type of food. Find them online and target them directly to their device, to their self-designed feed. That's the way of the future. It's already happening here in this country where I am. But I know that it's the only way to go because it's inexpensive, relatively inexpensive. You don't need to guess. You know exactly what's the impact of your advertising dollar. And the most important thing is you're targeting the relevant people.
Thank you. Thank you. Garvin, any thoughts from you on that from a Caribbean perspective?
No, I missed the beginning of the question because I was fiddling with my feed, and as you can see, I have a much better feed now.
Okay, yes, it was about countries' tourism authorities and other relevant bodies, and what are they doing to revive the sector through promotional videos and I guess marketing more generally. You know, are they doing enough? Does it need to change? Does it need to become perhaps a little bit less glossy and a little bit more pragmatic, safety driven, or to Ido's point, more targeted? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with what Ido said with regards to target marketing, and I think all marketing has become more target marketing, whether in tourism or any other product, because of social media. But surely the tourism, the CARICOM and the Caribbean tourism agencies, they would obviously be looking at redefining their tourism product. There's been talk about going a little more high-end, also looking at younger populations, because of course the older populations are more susceptible to the COVID virus. And you're looking at sort of the young professionals who could then come and you can tailor your product for them. In Trinidad, we have a lot of talk with regards to diversifying our economy more into tourism and looking at destination tourism, so that there are a number of cultural sites that we can develop for that kind of tourism, as well as even the possibility of being a hub for cruise ships. Because at the moment we have where cruise ships start in Miami and come south. Whereas if you start south and you go north, there is a possibility that you then isolate yourself from the larger infectious groups. Because we have seen very clearly as the US tried to reopen their economy, that immediately you're seeing spikes and record spikes in states. In fact, over the last 24 hours, you've seen record spikes in at least 6 states. And they're now thinking of closing again. So the issue again of risk has to be borne out. There is risk on both sides. From our side, we are looking at the risk of opening our borders to infectious persons, as opposed to us going into infectious countries. So there's a two-way risk that has to be looked at. And we can contain or reduce some of the risk by encouraging more sort of regional, inter-region tourism, because of course our numbers being low, we will tend to have lower risk of infection traveling inter-island. But it's when we reopen our borders to the major states where there is a large infection that the issues will arise.
Okay, thank you. So another question from anonymous attendee. I think this is one for you, James, if you don't mind. Since the UK has done so badly in its management of this pandemic, will British tourists be suspect and unwanted elsewhere? I imagine some parts of the world may have always had a slightly dim view of certain British tourists, but what's your thought on that? You know, are we trusted to travel elsewhere by those destinations?
I think there is probably a lingering effect of that kind. It's not categorical, and it doesn't mean we're going to be refused and so on. But yes, I think people will look askance at us. The way that we put in our own quarantine measures now signals to others that actually, they'd like to do the same to us, which is what the Europeans have done to us. I think the professionally managed big national tourism industries can judge the risk very well and will really want the Brits to come. It's very clear, the Spanish, the Greeks, the Portuguese, and Egyptians, and the Turks, they really want the Brits to come. So at the kind of official and organizational level, we're very welcome. But to the extent that we've handled things badly, we'll make people possibly take a few steps away from individual tourists as they show up. And I think it's also because the whole thing has become very politicized. For example, in China, the Communist Party's narrative has been very much to say how wonderful the Chinese handling of the pandemic has been and how dreadful other countries have been, and notably the United States, but also Europe. And I think this will have a very big effect on the attitudes of the Chinese traveler, who is instinctively probably very responsive to government advice and guidance, but also quite suspicious of the dirty foreigner, as it were, and would not like to travel again. That could be wrong. Chinese tourism is picking up nicely again in Southeast Asia, which admittedly has had very little COVID, but where there are still some risks. But I think we'll see more of a delay in people like the Chinese coming back to Europe than other groups.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So we've got 7 minutes maximum left. So I just had one question, which I thought would be interesting for any of your perspectives on really briefly. So the reliance on tourism as a sector. I mean, Garvin, you mentioned that Trinidad and Tobago is far less reliant than other nations in the Caribbean, some as much as 70%. But does that need a fundamental rethink? A lot of parts of the world, for example, shifted away from agriculture to tourism decades ago now. Is tourism potentially a fragile sector, or one that is overexposed to any kind of crisis like this in the future?
But I think it's becoming very, very clear that you cannot rely or build your economy being over-reliant on any one sector. Even with us in Trinidad, where we've relied on oil and gas, we've seen a diminishing of revenues from the oil and gas sector. And we've had the mantra of diversification for a long time. And of course, one of the products that we were looking at diversifying into is tourism. The other area is agriculture, and agriculture has become an important talking point because of closed borders. We have seen where food supply can run low. In addition, because you are no longer earning the levels of foreign exchange through traditional industry, you no longer have the income in foreign exchange to purchase food from abroad. And food safety, therefore, becomes a pillar of your national security policy. So that agriculture across the board, I think, is having a rethink. The smaller islands that used to be involved in agriculture, of course, it was because of policies taken by some of our larger friends that caused the dissemination of the agricultural sectors in those islands. And maybe with the help of larger friends, they can help them basically put that sector back into operation because of, and that way everyone benefits. So yes, diversification will have to be a significant part of managing one's economy moving forward.
Okay, thank you. And if we just have time for one final question, if that's okay for you, James. What will the impact on package travel be? So obviously, from a UK perspective, there was a big shift towards package travel in the 1970s, early 80s. Will we see a rethink around package travel because people are going to want to take breaks in different ways? And what will the impact be on cruises of that as well? Rosella, by the way, sends her apologies. She's had a crisis to deal with, another one, and has been pulled into a meeting and was unable to join us as planned. But what are your thoughts on the future of packaging?
I think the whole of the packaging market will remain very strong, and actually, it's a sector in which the companies can do a lot to provide those levels of assurance. They can, first of all, have deals with their providers, the hotels, etc., for very visible and reliable hygiene measures, which can be kind of certified and promoted as part of the advertising. They can give recommendations about where to go, what to do. I think they can make people feel safe. So I think actually the mass tourism, the package might even see a bit of a revival. I think as it were, the early movers in getting tourism back and leisure travel back will be the independent travelers, as I said earlier. But given just a little bit of time lag, I think the package companies could do really well. It's interesting. I'm sorry Rosetta's not here, but I think we've all read that the cruise ship industry has actually got record bookings a year ahead because people are quite sure they want to go back cruising again. They absolutely love it. They fundamentally trust it, even though they know the bad stories we've had during the pandemic. But I think this is very significant. There must be a lot of trust, I think. People who regularly go, who wouldn't go any other way, but who, as you say, really do need their holidays. They really do want that break. And they will listen to people who can give them the specific assurances they need and give them the almost personal handling, all that meeting and greeting and the uniformed tour operator guide at the airport, on the bus and so on. Very reassuring. I think there's a big future there.
Yes, so certainly a time where reassurance is a premium, I'm sure. So great. Well, we'll bring that to a close. Thank you both for taking part in that. I know Ido has had to drop for another session he's doing. But what have we heard about? I mean, a real need for safety to be addressed. It's clearly multi-dimensional, but a lot of talk that's still required to work through the very complex issues around getting people from one place to the other. And also, I think some real optimism around the speed at which tourism can revitalize itself, and you know, I imagine that has implications for travel more broadly, to work travel as well, but still lots to do. But in all of that, you know, trust is clearly very, very important, as is just action, appropriate action to earn that trust, and very clear communication around it, and at a time when we're getting so much information whizzing before our eyes every day. So more to come on this, I'm sure. Thank you both again for joining. Thank you for all of our guests for attending today and for your thoughtful questions. Really appreciate it. We look forward to bringing another one to you soon. Thank you again.